The conference room on the 41st floor of Harwick Tower had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over downtown Charlotte. And on a clear Tuesday morning in October, you could see all the way to the edge of the city, where the buildings thinned into neighborhoods and then into the particular green of the Carolina Piedmont beyond. It was the kind of view that announced itself. The kind that said, everyone in this room has arrived somewhere. I had been in that room before. 7 times in 6 years, to be precise, because I had been keeping count in the specific way of someone who understood that the number mattered even when no one else was tracking it. 7 times I had sat across that conference table from the partners of Harwick Capital Group and presented my fund's quarterly performance with the care and preparation of someone who knew that the work was excellent, and that excellent work, in that particular room, was necessary but not sufficient. 7 times they had thanked me and redirected the conversation and found elegant ways to indicate that the moment was not yet right. The 8th time was different. The 8th time I walked in with a document that contained a number they had not expected, and a set of relationships they had not anticipated, and a track record that had in the 3 years since my 7th meeting in that room grown from impressive to undeniable in the specific way that compounding works, quietly for a long time and then all at once. The number was $58 million. That was the value of the committed capital I had brought to the table that Tuesday morning from a set of institutional investors who had found me, over 3 years of consistent outperformance, more interesting than the partners of Harwick Capital Group had ever allowed themselves to find me. I set the document on the table. I watched the room change. I had been waiting 6 years for that specific change, and I had prepared for it with the patience of someone who understood that the people who mock you are always in the end working for you, building the record of their own misjudgment that you will one day be able to lay quietly on a conference room table and let speak for itself. Let me take you back to the beginning. Because $58 million does not arrive from nowhere, and the room that morning did not change because of luck. It changed because of 6 years of a specific, deliberate, documented decision to refuse the version of myself that room had always tried to hand me. My name is Vivienne Oseistrand. I am 39 years old. I am the founder and managing partner of Meridian Capital Partners, a boutique investment fund based in Charlotte, North Carolina, that I launched 4 years ago with $300,000 of my own money. 2 limited partners who believed in the thesis before the thesis had a track record and the particular clarity of someone who had spent 6 years being told she was not quite ready and had finally understood that not quite ready was not a professional assessment. It was a power structure maintaining itself. I grew up in Accra, Ghana, came to the United States at 16 with my parents when my father's engineering work brought us to Charlotte, and spent the following years navigating the specific experience of being a West African immigrant woman in American financial services, which is an experience I will describe not with bitterness, but with accuracy. Because accuracy is the foundation of every good investment thesis, and it is the foundation of this story. I studied economics and finance at UNC Charlotte on a scholarship I had applied for in my 2nd year in the country. With English that was functional and an understanding of financial markets that was already at 18 more sophisticated than most of my classmates, because my father had taught me to read a balance sheet before I could drive a car. I graduated with honors. I completed a master's degree in financial analysis. I sat for and passed the CFA examination on my first attempt. I was 24 years old when I walked into Harwick Capital Group for my first interview. Harwick Capital was one of Charlotte's established mid-size investment management firms. Not the largest, not the most prestigious, but solid, well-regarded. The kind of firm whose partners had grown up in the same neighborhoods and gone to the same universities and moved in the same social circles and had built something real through a combination of competence and connection that they would have described if asked as meritocracy. It was not meritocracy, but the gap between what they called it and what it was had not yet become visible to me in its full dimensions. And I was 24 and had excellent credentials and the specific optimism of someone who has been told her whole life that excellence is the path. They hired me as a junior analyst. I spent 6 years at Harwick. I want to tell you about those 6 years accurately because the inaccurate version, the version where I was simply overlooked and mistreated and then triumphed, leaves out the part that actually matters, which is the work. The 6 years at Harwick were not 6 years of suffering. They were 6 years of building, under conditions that were more difficult than they should have been, a competence that eventually became the foundation of everything that came after. The difficulty and the competence were not separate. They were the same thing experienced from different angles. The difficulty arrived in forms that were individually subtle and collectively unambiguous. In year 1, the junior analyst cohort, 5 people, including me, was socialized into the firm through the standard mechanisms of shared work and shared space and the gradual accumulation of institutional knowledge. I was the only woman in the cohort. I was the only person who was not from the American South or who did not have a family connection to someone already at the firm. These facts were not discussed. They were simply present, the way weather is present, shaping everything while being named by nobody. The feedback I received in year 1 was uniformly positive and uniformly specific in a way that I later understood was different from the feedback my cohort peers received. Their feedback was about their trajectory. Mine was about their current performance. They were told where they were going. I was told what I had done well. The distinction is subtle. It is also the difference between being managed as an investment and being managed as a resource, and I noticed it before I had language for it. In year 2, I led my first significant analysis, a sector assessment for a healthcare technology allocation that the partners were considering. The work was thorough, original in its approach to a particular valuation methodology, and produced a recommendation that the partners ultimately adopted. The presentation of that work to the full investment committee was led by my direct supervisor, a man named Richard Crane, who referenced my contribution once, in passing, in a 12-minute presentation. I noted this. In year 3, 2 of my cohort peers were promoted to associate analyst. I was not. The explanation I received was that the timing was not quite right, that the committee felt I needed more exposure to client relationships, that there were plans in place to give me those opportunities. The explanation was delivered by Richard Crane in the tone of someone who was uncomfortable with the conversation and wanted it to conclude efficiently. I did not make it conclude efficiently. I asked specifically what client relationship experience I was missing and how I could obtain it. I asked what the timeline was for reconsideration. I asked for the criteria to be articulated in writing so that I could demonstrate I had met them. This last request produced in Richard Crane's expression a specific quality, the flicker of someone encountering a response they had not anticipated from the person they were managing. That told me something important about how I was being perceived and why. He did not provide the written criteria. I was promoted to associate analyst 6 months later. On a timeline that had nothing to do with any of the explanations I had been given and everything to do with the fact that a client had specifically requested my involvement in their portfolio review, and the firm had been required to formalize a status that matched the work I was already doing. In year 4, something happened that I have thought about many times since, because it was the moment in which the informal became explicit, and the explicit became the thing I could not unknow. There was a gathering, the firm's annual retreat, held at a golf resort outside Charlotte, 2 days of what the invitation described as strategic planning and relationship building. The events of the first evening were social. Dinner, drinks, the particular loosening of professional register that alcohol and resort settings produce. I was at a table with 3 partners and one of the firm's senior clients, a man named Thomas Wardwell who managed a family office out of Charlotte and whose portfolio with Harwick represented one of the firm's largest relationships. At some point in the evening, after the 3rd round of drinks had been delivered, one of the partners, a man named Carter Bledsoe, 51 years old, golf, firsthand the specific confidence of someone who has never been in a room where he was not comfortable, turned to Wardwell and said, in the conspiratorial tone of someone who was being funny in the way that people are funny when they believe they are among their own, "Thomas, what do you think of our diversity hire? She's actually quite good, isn't she?" The table laughed. I was sitting at that table. I did not react. I held my expression at the specific neutral I had been practicing for 4 years. I picked up my water glass, and I took a drink, and I continued listening to the conversation that moved on past me with the ease of something that had not required a response. Internally, I was running the accounting. Not of the insult. I had been running that accounting for 4 years, and the balance was already substantial. I was running the accounting of the opportunity. Carter Bledsoe had just told me, with the precision of someone who believed they were speaking among themselves, exactly what the ceiling was. Not the ceiling I had suspected. The ceiling as they understood it, articulated in their own words, in the specific language they used when they thought I was not fully a witness to it. Diversity hire. Quite good. Isn't she? They had hired me as a symbol and been surprised by a person. I excused myself from the table shortly after. I went to my room. I sat at the desk by the window, and I opened my laptop, and I began the document I would spend the next 2 years building. A structured analysis of the investment thesis I had been developing since year 2. The sector focus that I believed was underserved by existing fund structures, the specific edge I had built through 6 years of doing the work that other people took credit for. I called it the foundation document. It was the first page of what would become Meridian Capital Partners. Year 5 was the year I understood what I was building toward and began building toward it deliberately. I continued doing excellent work at Harwick because excellent work was what I did, and because the track record mattered, and because nothing I was planning required me to do anything differently in my professional conduct. I met with potential investors in my own time, evenings, weekends, the margins of a professional life that did not have a great deal of margin. I refined the thesis. I identified the specific market inefficiency I believed my fund could exploit. I built relationships with the institutional contacts I had developed over 5 years of client-facing work that the firm had initially withheld from me and then given me because the clients had insisted. I also, in year 5, had my 7th meeting in the 41st floor conference room. The 7th meeting followed the pattern of the previous 6. I presented the portfolio I was managing, which was, by year 5, performing in the top quartile of comparable funds by every metric the firm tracked. The partners thanked me. They discussed the numbers. They found the elegant language for not quite yet. I thanked them. I left. I drove to my apartment and I called Adiz Akaffer, who was my closest friend and had been since graduate school, and who had spent the previous 3 years watching me build what I was building and asking with increasing frequency. When I was going to stop waiting for the firm's permission to exist at the level I was already operating, I said, "I think I'm ready." She said, "You've been ready for 2 years. What changed?" I said, "They told me I was a diversity hire in year 4, and I spent a year being angry about it. And then I spent a year understanding that they were right about what they hired me for and wrong about what they got. And I think it's time they found out the difference." Adiz was quiet for a moment. She said, "What do you need?" I said, "I need you to introduce me to the 2 people at your firm who you think might be interested in an emerging manager fund with a healthcare tech thesis and a 5-year track record that I can document." She said, "I can do that." She introduced me to 3 people, not 2, and one of those introductions led to another, and then another, and over the following 12 months. While I was still employed at Harwick Capital, doing the work that had always produced results regardless of what the 41st floor conference room thought about its own generosity in providing me the opportunity, I was building the investor base that would make Meridian Capital Partners real. I left Harwick on a Friday afternoon in June, 3 years ago. I gave 6 weeks' notice. I completed every ongoing project. I documented the transition with the thoroughness of someone who understood that how you leave tells people who you are. Richard Crane told me, in our final meeting, that he hoped I understood what I was giving up: the stability, the resources, the backing of an established firm. He said this in the tone of genuine concern, which was perhaps real, and was certainly also the tone of a man who had spent 5 years managing a resource, and was now understanding that the resource had been building something he had not been informed about. I thanked him for the years. I meant it for what it was worth. I spent the following 3 months launching Meridian with the $300,000 of my own capital, the 2 initial limited partners Adiz introductions had produced, and the healthcare technology investment thesis I had been refining for 4 years. The thesis was specific and differentiated. A focus on health equity technology companies building digital health infrastructure specifically designed to serve underserved populations, that I believed were systematically undervalued by the mainstream investment market because the mainstream investment market did not have the cultural competency to assess their market opportunity accurately. This was not a social impact thesis in the philanthropic sense. This was an alpha thesis. It was a bet that the market was wrong about a segment it did not understand well enough to price correctly, and that the person best positioned to correct that mispricing was someone who understood the segment from both sides, the investment side and the cultural side. The combination of those understandings was the edge. The edge worked. In year 1, Meridian's portfolio returned 22% against a market that returned 7%. In year 2, 31% against 14%. In year 3, we had 2 exits, portfolio companies that were acquired by larger health systems at multiples that generated significant returns for our investors. The track record was building in the specific way that my father had described compound interest building when I was a child in Accra, quietly for a long time, and then all at once. By the end of year 3, I had a meeting request from Harwick Capital Group. Not a job offer, a partnership inquiry. Carter Bledsoe sent the email personally, which I noted with the specific attention I gave to all significant data points. He described Harwick as interested in exploring strategic partnerships with emerging managers in the health technology space. He described Meridian's performance as having come to their attention. He wrote with the particular warmth of someone who has decided that the relationship they are initiating is one they have always valued. I read the email 3 times. Then I called Sandra Acaffer, Adiz's sister, an attorney who specialized in fund structuring and partnerships and who had been advising Meridian since its launch. And I told her I had received an approach from Harwick and I wanted to think about it very carefully. Sandra said, "What are you thinking?" I said, "I'm thinking about what they actually want and whether what I actually want is compatible with it." What Harwick wanted, as the subsequent conversations made clear, was access. Access to Meridian's deal flow, access to our institutional investor relationships, access to the health equity technology sector in which we had established a recognized position. They wanted the edge I had built without them, and had built, in part, because of the decisions they had made about me over 6 years. What I actually wanted was specific, and had been specific since the evening at the golf resort, when Carter Bledsoe had said the word diversity hire at a table I was sitting at. I wanted to walk into that conference room on the 41st floor with something they could not acquire without me, and I wanted to put it on the table, and I wanted to watch the room understand what it was looking at. The partnership negotiation took 4 months. Sandra negotiated every clause with the precision of someone who had read enough poorly structured agreements to understand where the vulnerabilities were and how to close them. I was present in every negotiation session, not as the secondary voice, not as the face the firm's interest had been assigned to, but as the principal, the person whose decisions determined the outcome. This required Carter Bledsoe and the other Harwick partners to negotiate with me directly, which they did with the particular adaptation of people who are used to being the most important person in the room and are encountering someone who has more leverage than they had anticipated. The leverage was the $58 million. That was the committed capital I had accumulated from institutional investors over 3 years. Not retail money, not friends and family money, but endowments and foundations and family offices that had found Meridian through performance and had stayed through consistency. $58 million of committed capital from investors who followed me, not the firm, which meant that any partnership structure that did not adequately address my position as the source of that capital relationship was a structure that could be dissolved if the terms were wrong. Sandra had made this clear in the first negotiation session, in a way that had produced in the room a silence I had been working toward for 6 years. The morning I walked into the 41st floor conference room for the 8th time, I walked in as the principal of a fund with a 3-year verified track record and $58 million of institutional capital committed to my thesis. I walked in with Sandra beside me and with the specific posture of someone who has spent 6 years being underestimated and has stopped performing any accommodations to it. I set the document on the table. Carter Bledsoe picked it up. I watched him read it. I want to describe what his face did, and I want to do it accurately rather than satisfyingly, because the accurate description is more interesting than the satisfying one. He did not collapse. He did not display shame or recognition, or any of the emotional responses that would make this a more dramatic moment. What he displayed was the specific recalibration of a person who has been doing arithmetic and has arrived at a different answer than they expected. A recalibration that was entirely professional and entirely genuine, and that told me everything I needed to know about how I had always been experienced in that room, as a number to be assessed, and the number had changed. He said, "This is impressive, Vivienne." I said, "Thank you." He said, "The health equity thesis has performed beyond what most of the market would have projected." I said, "It performed what I projected. I've had the projection in writing since year 2 of my time at this firm." He looked at me. I said, "I'm saying that calmly and as a fact, not as a complaint. I want us to have an honest conversation about this partnership, which means starting with an accurate understanding of where the thesis came from and why it worked." He said, "Of course." He said it the way people say of course when they are agreeing to something that costs them something, and they have determined the cost is worth the agreement. The partnership was finalized 6 weeks later. The terms Sandra negotiated gave Meridian independence of investment decision, which meant Harwick could not override my portfolio choices. They gave me a seat on Harwick's investment committee as a full partner, not a courtesy presence. They gave Meridian's limited partners the specific protections that ensured the institutional relationships followed me regardless of any future changes in the partnership structure. And they gave me, as managing partner of Meridian, an economics position in the combined entity that reflected the value I was bringing rather than the hierarchy I was joining. I am not going to give you the specific financial terms because they are confidential. I will tell you that they were what I asked for because what I asked for was what Sandra had established in 4 months of negotiation. Was the market rate for what I was bringing, and the partners of Harwick had determined the alternative, losing access to Meridian's deal flow and investor relationships entirely, was more expensive. The day the partnership agreement was signed, I called my father in Charlotte. He was 67 now, still following markets with the attention he had developed over 40 years, still reading balance sheets with the patience he had transmitted to me before I could drive. He said, "Tell me." I told him the number, the 58 million, the partnership terms. The investment committee seat. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And how long did it take?" I said, 6 years at the firm, 3 years building Meridian, 9 years total. He said, "And they called you ready after 9 years?" I said, "No." I stopped asking them when I was ready. I decided for myself. He laughed, the specific laugh he had when something confirmed a theory he had held for a long time. He said, "That is the only way it works." He was right. It is the only way it works. You stop asking the people who benefit from your uncertainty to confirm your readiness. You build the evidence yourself. You document it carefully. You take it to the room and you set it on the table and you let it speak because it has more authority than anything you could say about yourself. I want to tell you about Adiz because she deserves to be in this story specifically rather than generally. She had watched me build for 6 years before the partnership and had been, in every sense of the word, the person who made it possible. Not through any single action, but through the consistent presence of someone who believed the thesis before the thesis had a track record. She had made the introductions that seeded the investor base. She had been the voice on the other end of the phone on the evenings when the building was slow and the patience required was more than I had comfortably available. She had asked the question, "When are you going to stop waiting for their permission?" at the exact moment when the question was ready to be heard. At the closing dinner for the partnership, in a restaurant overlooking the same Charlotte skyline visible from the 41st floor, she raised her glass and said, "To the diversity hire." I raised mine. We both understood exactly what that meant. I am 39 years old. I run a fund that has returned consistent alpha for 3 years with an institutional investor base that includes some of the most sophisticated capital allocators in the healthcare sector. I sit on the investment committee of one of Charlotte's established firms as a full partner with the authority that designation actually means. I teach a course once a year at UNC Charlotte's Business School on emerging market investment strategy, which means I am building, one student at a time, the next generation of people who will look at underserved markets and see not charity but opportunity. I am also on the first Tuesday of every month in the 41st floor conference room of Harwick Tower. My name is on the agenda, not as a presenter who is thanked and redirected, as a partner whose decisions shape the direction of the meeting. It took 9 years. It required the patience to build when the building was invisible, and the conviction to refuse the ceiling that the room had tried to assign me, and the specific practical. Documented work of turning a thesis into a track, record into a number that a conference room could not argue with. $58 million. My father taught me to read a balance sheet. He taught me that the most important number is always the one you verified yourself. He was right about that too. The people who told you that you were not ready, they were not assessing your capability. They were protecting their comfort. Build the evidence. Document the track record. And when the number is real, and the room has no argument left, walk in and set it on the table. Subscribe and stay close, because I have a story next week about a woman who built something they said couldn't be built, and did it in a place they said she didn't belong.